Carol, Phil, thanks so much for joining me on the show tonight. Congratulations on the book. It's fascinating. Phil, let me start with you. You both spent hours with the man. You interviewed everyone around him. Perhaps the most important question still remains, though. Is he actually going to run again in 2024? What's your take, Phil?
You know, it is an important question, and you're right. Carol and I spent 2.5 hours down at Mar-a-Lago with President Trump, and we interviewed more than 140 of his senior-most administration officials, advisors, family members, and so on. And you know, if you had asked me this question a couple months ago, I would say probably not. But he increasingly sounds like somebody who wants to run again in 2024 for a rematch with President Biden. And I think if you put a gun to his head and made him make a decision tomorrow, the decision would very well be yes. But we should keep in mind that 3.5 years, which is how long it is between now and the next presidential election, is an eternity in politics. He's 75 years old. Yes. Who knows what health is going to be like a year from now when he has to make that decision. So it's very much an open question.
And of course, there's the argument that he's just leaving it hanging open so he can dominate the party while not having to do anything. Carol, even if he doesn't run, you went to Mar-a-Lago. You went to Mar-a-Lago, Carol. Even if he doesn't run, he'll still be holding court there in 2024. He bragged to you about how many people make the pilgrimage there to kiss the ring. How does another GOP presidential nominee even manage to get out from under the Trump spotlight, given Trump's not going to stop running his mouth between now and then?
He absolutely isn't. I mean, he was willing, Mehdi, to meet with Phil and with me. We are individuals he has called low-rent reporters. We are people he excoriated as, you know, the worst fake news you can imagine. And yet he graciously and charmingly invited us to Mar-a-Lago so that he could give us his sort of alternate version of reality, his words, his beliefs about what a wonderful way he governed and led through the crises of 2020. And, you know, one of the things people need to keep in mind is you may make fun of Donald Trump, but he is a genius at mastering the megaphone. And he has captivated millions of Americans who are angry, scared, and even some who are white supremacists and nationalists. He has stoked their anger and their fear, and they cleave to him and they adore him.
They do indeed. And Phil, Carol mentioned, you know, some of the stuff that he says in his alternative reality that he inhabits. In that interview you did with him, and I was reading the Vanity Fair excerpt in particular, which sums it up, Trump serves up lies and lies and lies with a generous side of nonsense. He says to you the election was rigged and stolen. He says George Washington and Abraham Lincoln together couldn't beat him. He says, quote, statistically it wasn't even possible that Biden won. He says thousands of dead people voted. He says we did a great job on COVID. You are reporters for one of the great newspapers of record, a paper that found Trump had told more than 30,000 lies while in office. I wonder, it's very different doing a print book interview to an on-camera TV interview. What was it like for you to sit there, both of you, and listen to a man like that rant for 2.5 hours saying nonsense? Do you just have to nod along? Did you get to interject?
Well, it's a good question. You know, we're journalists and we think in terms of facts and truth, and we're rational people. So we knew most of what he was saying was BS, to put it lightly. But, you know, it was not a live television interview, and we felt like it was better to hear what he had to say, and we challenged him at particular moments, but we didn't challenge him every single time he said something that was untrue, because you would end up just talking in a circle with him and not getting anywhere. And the reason we went down to Mar-a-Lago was to understand inside his head, to capture his thinking. It was an important element in our book. We had, at that point, spoken to, as I said, more than 140 people around him who painted a picture of a complete failure when it comes to managing these crises in his final year in office. But we wanted to hear from him directly how he assessed that year, what his regrets were, and so forth. But we did importantly press him on his lies, why he told so many things that were not true to the American people, including about science, but about other matters as well. And he had a very revealing line to us. He said, look, are you talking about lies or are you talking about disinformation? Because there's a beautiful word called disinformation.
Which I'm sure he's just discovered. Carol, on the subject of lies, here's a question I want to ask not just you guys. I'm asking, Michael Bender came on the show, a lot of the Trump book authors. How do you write a book which involves talking to so many serial fabulists without unwittingly even doing their bidding. Because in these accounts, some people always seem to be doing or saying the right thing at the right time to Trump, even when he doesn't heed them. People like Mark Milley come out of the book well, Bill Barr, Ivanka Trump, who we know has been on an image rehab tour of sorts. Ivanka shamelessly, in particular, has been trying to kind of sell her image as the moderate in the administration. In your book, Ivanka's pushing for Trump to tell the Capitol rioters to go home. You write, quote, as soon as she saw on the television in her second floor office that the rioters were inside the Capitol, Ivanka Trump said to her aides, I'm going to go down to my dad. This has to stop. Which sounds great, Carol, but I'm old enough to remember that she tweeted on January the 6th that the Capitol rioters were patriots before quickly deleting that. And I understand the constraints you guys work under. I wrote a biography of a British political leader years ago. It's a nightmare to interview so many different people, put together their conflicting accounts. But the Trump people are uniquely dishonest among political people. So how did you get around that?
I'm so glad you asked because, you know, it's important for us to explain this. And I think actually in this era of fake news and also your rightful criticism, or question rather, about, you know, are people trying to resculpt and rehab their image? It's important for us to sort of show our work, as you will. And I think it's really important to say that Bill and I are pretty rigorous, disciplined, excruciating, painstaking reporters. And we were on guard for exactly what you're talking about, on guard for Ivanka or Jared or others to basically, you know, try to make themselves just look a little bit better in the wake of our democracy almost coming off the rails, almost coming unglued, yes, amid fears of a potential coup. And what I can tell you without identifying sources is that Phil and I went to people who would not have had Ivanka's best interests at stake, who would not have been on Ivanka's side, who reported that this is exactly what happened. There were many things people told us that are not in this book because we could not corroborate them with objective witnesses. We could not corroborate them with documentation. Those things are important to us, and we don't want a fabulous or partially fabulous book. Everything in here, yes, we feel really firm and good about.
Carol, thanks so much for explaining that, and I appreciate that explanation. Although I'm shocked to hear you say there are people who are not on Ivanka's side. Who could they be? Phil, a lot of Trump defenders, when told he was authoritarian, respond that if that's the case, why didn't he suspend the election entirely? Why didn't he send troops in after Black Lives Matter protesters? In your book, Trump repeatedly wants to fire FBI Director Chris Wray and install loyalists like Kash Patel in the FBI or the Pentagon. And every time he's called down on it by Barr or Milley or someone else, he backs down. I wonder, Phil, do we get to the bottom of why he backed down? He broke so many norms. How come he didn't go further? Is he authoritarian, the way you tell him in your book, or is he just a lazy guy who's too lazy to be authoritarian? I'm just trying to get to the bottom of that.
You know, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. He certainly has authoritarian impulses and sort of the character of an authoritarian running through his leadership throughout his presidency from day one. But he didn't always act as an authoritarian, and I think that's in part because he was afraid in certain moments to pull the trigger. You're right that he wanted to fire the FBI director, Christopher Wray, but he became convinced in each of those moments that doing so could have consequential harm for him personally and politically, that if he were to fire Chris Wray as the FBI director, it would spawn a new investigation, or it would make him look unhinged, or it could result in other resignations in his cabinet that could make him, as a governing figure, appear weak heading into the election. So he was always calculating and thinking about these decisions in the context of himself, his own personal political outcomes, and, you know, ultimately became persuaded many times by the Attorney General Bill Barr and by Milley when it came to the military decisions not to follow his authoritarian impulses, but those impulses were there nevertheless. And I have to tell you, in those days between the election and Joe Biden's inauguration is when the impulses were the strongest and when President Trump appeared the most unhinged, the people he was talking to behind the scenes, and that's when Milley was fearing an actual coup.
Yes, as you both document so well. Carol, one last question. You interviewed more than 100 people for this book, hundreds of other people over the last few years of the Trump era. era. In your view, how do the people around Trump ultimately come off? Did they succeed in curbing those authoritarian impulses Phil mentioned, or did they bring out some of the worst of those impulses? How should history remember the people around Trump? As people who enabled him or people who constrained him?
You know, as I hear you ask that question, I feel like many of these people, some of whom we interviewed and some of whose accounts we painstakingly documented, come off as people who held on to a rickety roller coaster that was literally falling apart as they rode it. I feel like they succeeded in holding on long enough for someone worse to not be installed. And many people, did not talk to us in real time for our reporting for the Washington Post and the public. But when we were doing this book reporting, they revealed to us that they had been afraid of him, afraid to come forward, afraid to object. And you can tell from the book what happened to those who objected to him. They had their quote unquote faces ripped off in public meetings with other cabinet members staring on. They were also afraid of being replaced by something even worse. A yes man who would let the president's sort of daily win the news cycle impulses win, who would let his really unhinged effort to have that hand on the wheel, to stay in the Oval Office, that somebody would allow and really effectively help him do it. In this case, most of the people blocked him or sidetracked him, really. And again, they just held on for dear life.